House now comes to questions for oral answer, and the first question stands the name of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will he prevent shares sold in New Zealand-owned and taxpayer-owned assets, such as our power companies, being on-sold to foreign corporates? If so, how?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, one of the tests we set for extending the mixed ownership model to companies other than just Air New Zealand was that there would be widespread and substantial New Zealand share ownership. We're still working through the details of that, but our expectation is that having New Zealanders at the front of the queue is one thing, and given that the likely strong demand for shares from the likes of KiwiSaver funds, Crown financial institutions and Kiwi mums and dads, such restrictions are likely to be unnecessary to achieving that test. And by holding a stake of more than 50%, the government will ensure there is always a majority New Zealand ownership.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So when Tony Ryle told the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the 22nd of June, when asked, quote, how would you guarantee that those shares would not be on-sold to foreign multinationals? And he answered, quote, well, you can't guarantee on those issues. Then actually Tony Ryle was right, contrary to the Prime Minister's questioning of that statement yesterday.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think the debate is what level of foreign ownership would there be, and because there's a majority held by the Crown as a starting point, because New Zealanders will be put at the front of the queue, we know by definition the majority has to be in New Zealand hands. And I say, Mr Speaker, if it was such an amazing issue, why did Labour in 9 years in office never bother having the same restrictions they seem to be talking about now on the balance of Air New Zealand shares held by the public?
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Did it pass by the Prime Minister's attention?
I apologise to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. A little more reason please. Reasonableness on both sides, because it was very difficult for me to hear the Prime Minister's first answer because of the noise on my left, and difficult for me to hear the start of the Leader of the Opposition's question then because of the noise on my right. So just a little more reasonableness. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Did the Prime Minister somehow miss that in the 9 years of the last Labor government we sold no assets off to foreign corporates? In fact, we bought them back, such as the New Zealand Rail, which was sold at a cheap price by a national government to the huge detriment of this country.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, if Phil Goff thinks buying Kiwi Rail was a good deal for the taxpayer, I can see why he holidays in Greece these days. But anyway, putting that all...
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard. No, order. Apologise to the member. Order. Now look, a point of order has been called. The House must respect our basic rules. We can have a passionate exchange. Well, I shouldn't say that. We can have a noisy exchange, but we won't ignore the basic rules of the House. The point of order has been called. The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
And it's a simple point of order, Mr Speaker. The comments that the Prime Minister made about the private travel and family travel
order
of the Leader of the Opposition clearly led to disorder and were designed to do so.
My dilemma is I couldn't hear what the Prime Minister said in his answer now, and that's my difficulty. I could not rule on whether or not, if I'd been asked to rule on whether or not the Prime Minister answered the first question, I couldn't because I couldn't hear his answer. Now, the solution to this is in the House's hands. If the Speaker is to do his job, he must be able to hear. I just ask members to be sensible about that. And so I can't rule on something I simply didn't hear. Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, can I please ask that you ask the technicians to have another look at the sound system? If we can hear it over here, sir, the sound system can't be working properly if you can't.
Well, I also accept that maybe my ears are inferior to the members, and I apologise if that's the case. But the noise level simply makes it very difficult for me, and I ask members to be more reasonable. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, supplementary.
Mr Speaker, supplementary. When the Prime Minister answered in the House yesterday that Treasury advice says that, and the quote is, widespread and substantial New Zealand ownership is achievable, end quote, why didn't he finish the sentence, the very same sentence that advice was included in, which went on to say, but significant participation by foreign investors will be essential to achieve the government's overall objectives? Why didn't he reveal that advice to the House?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
See, because that advice has been in the public domain for quite some time and the government rejects it. But, Mr Speaker, one bit of Treasury advice we do accept is that a capital gains tax at 15% on rental property
Order. That is not acceptable. Nothing to do with the question asked. The question asked was actually a fair question, and that last part was unacceptable. The Labor Party just has earned themselves a further supplementary question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again to the Prime Minister, did Treasury advise him and his Minister of Finance that strong foreign ownership restrictions would lead to net benefits from sale not being realised, and is that why he's refusing to put strong restrictions on foreign corporate ownership of New Zealand and taxpayer-owned assets?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no, because we took the same approach that Labor did when they were in government, and that was that they held 73% of Air New Zealand, didn't find any need for restrictions, because as they know, those shares that were held in the public domain didn't actually, for the most part, flow overseas.
The Honourable
Speaker,
the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
when the Prime Minister said in the House yesterday, and again I quote, arrogance would be to take a position where one passes the law and carries it out without reference to the New Zealand public, end quote, does he believe that it's also arrogant for his government to have banked the proceeds of the sale of the privatisation of those assets in this year's budget and to have spent $6 million of taxpayers' money in scoping out the study for privatisation without any mandate at all from the New Zealand public?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, but I do think it would be arrogant to go and try and tell the press gallery that a capital gains tax would raise $4.5 billion when in fact it'll only raise $700 million. And if it will raise $4.5 billion, then that said capital gains tax would have to be on a batch of rural property, a commercial property, any rental property anyone owns, any shares. And by the way, that probably won't be happening, because even then they'd be polling under the Greens at that point.
Rahui Karane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he agree that iwi and hapu are attractive commercial partners for the Crown because of their intergenerational investment outlook? And if so, what commitments can he give to iwi and hapu that they will have first right of response before any New Zealand-owned assets come up for consideration?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I do agree that iwi and hapu would be attractive long-term shareholders. They will be given the same rights as other New Zealanders to be at the front of the queue. And what iwi and hapu are demonstrating through their commercial arms is they, like many, many other New Zealanders, through their KiwiSaver accounts, through the Crown financial institutions and through their savings, actually want to buy shares in good-performing New Zealand companies instead of having failed finance companies to invest in, as was the case under a Labor government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, when the Prime Minister earlier this afternoon said that he was considering transferring shares from the taxpayer, the government, to Crown financial institutions to help to aid in the privatisation, how does that actually help the economy, particularly when CRIs pay more for their borrowing than the government does?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we were talking about transferring, we're talking about selling, and this might come as a really novel idea to Phil Goff, but actually I reckon it's quite a good idea if the New Zealand Super Fund buys shares in Genesis Power rather than buying them in an Australian energy company. I don't know about everyone else, but I happen to think investing in New Zealand is a great idea.
The Order. The Honourable Heather Roy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Supplementary to the Prime Minister. Can he recall any precedents of previous governments allowing New Zealand-owned and taxpayer-owned assets to be on-sold to foreign corporates? If so, which ministers at the time were involved in the policy implementation?
Mr.
Speaker,
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I can recall that. I remember certainly Phil Goff and Annette King being ministers in a government that sold assets. I can remember Trevor Mallard being in Parliament. And, Mr Speaker, if you'll bear with me and just give me an extra few moments, I'm happy to read the list. They would include New Zealand Steel, Petrocorp, Health Computing Services, DFC, Post Office Savings Bank, Shipping Corporation, Air New Zealand, Landcorp Financial Instruments, Rural Bank, Government Printing Office, National Film Unit, Communications New Zealand, State Insurance Office, the Tourist Holdings Corporation of New Zealand Liquid Fuels, the Forestry Cutting Rights, all of which added to a quick $9.761 billion flogged off by Phil Goff, who's now apparently opposed to asset sales.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. Order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, why...
Order. I apologise to the Leader. Now, look, I say to the National Front bench, I've asked the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to ask this question. It should be possible to hear it. I'm sure the Prime Minister wants to hear it. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Why hasn't National learnt the lessons of history and the failures of past privatisation, as the last Labor government did, which sold no assets, knowing that the sale of some assets, like New Zealand Rail, led to asset stripping, others, like Air New Zealand, led to a previously successful business being run into bankruptcy, and the sale by National of the BNZ for a mere $1.5 billion has resulted in $12.5 billion worth of dividends flowing out of this country. Why hasn't he learnt those lessons?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I actually think the Leader of the Opposition asked a good question, and that is, actually, this government has learnt those lessons. That's exactly why there'll be majority ownership held by the government. That's exactly why Kiwi mums and dads will be at the front of the queue. But I say this to the Leader of the Opposition in all sincerity. The investment portfolios around New Zealand have changed. Back in the late 80s and 90s, there wasn't 1.7 million KiwiSaver accounts. There weren't Crown financial institutions. Those entities are actually not in the form there is today. Not in the form there is today, and what they are looking for is genuine investments in New Zealand companies. Well, what they're not looking for, Trevor, is a capital gains tax on everything they may ever own.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order.
Has he and his government...
Order.
Speaker,
the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Has he and his government been advised by Treasury and other officials that the cost to the taxpayer of actually selling these assets could be between 2 and 9% of their value, which, if you take the midpoint of those figures, mean that he'll be spending $340 million worth of taxpayers' money just to flog off the assets to foreign corporates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No. What we have actually been advised by Treasury is that the average cost of an IPO is around about 7%. In the United States, it's 3 to 4%. In fact, when Contact Energy was sold off, I think it was about 1.8%. And that's exactly what we're working towards. And the member knows that because, in fact, the advice was presented to his office some months ago when he was away.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table a letter to the Minister of Finance from the Crown Ownership Monitoring Unit dated the 17th of May 2011 that says in New Zealand large IPOs in recent years have cost around 2 to 9%, the figure I quoted.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Question number 2, Pesitas Sam Lord Tuienga.
Speaker, thank you.